So I'm no longer just a disembodied voice. There actually is more, and this is it. But since, if anybody watched the last video I put up, you'll probably realise that I'm really into books, and I thought today I would just do a quick reading of something that I wrote, because I've been working on this for a very long time, and I think I've finally gotten to the point where I can't do too much more to change it, and I have to kind of just make up my mind what I'm doing with it. So first step to sharing, I'm just going to read you the opening, the first part of the first chapter. I'm just going to go ahead and read off the paper because I'm a fan of paper. So I apologise about my voice, it's not very nice. My uncle once told me that you can never look at the same part of an ocean twice. Once a wave has turned over and disappeared, then it's gone. The next time the light breaks over it, whatever it illuminates is something entirely new. So when I imagine myself as I was then, at the beginning of the trail he'd left for me into his past, I realise now that I'd never have reached it because, truthfully, it was no longer there. I didn't believe him then. It seemed as though that past was calling out to me. I've been silent too long, it whispered. The voice was soft and fragile. Perhaps I should have known better than to disturb it. I should have known better, but I don't feel sorry. He taught me never to be sorry. But I will admit that I was wrong in a way. I think he'd approve of that. We were both wrong. I was never truly returning, and the trouble for him was that he never really left. We can go away and come back older, but always, that other you is still out there. I suppose in the end, we were alike. It's hard for me to say exactly when I began that journey, if I can honestly say I began it at all. I've come to think of that time in our lives as my inheritance. It started with my uncle and with my mother and father, but since none of them are at liberty to say, and I wouldn't like to be accused of putting words in their mouths, I can only say that it began for me the summer before I was 21. Stepping into his office, that day at the beginning of August, I hovered in the doorway, his name, Samuel Hawkridge, painted in gold letters behind me, as I watched his head bent over his work. It took him a moment to look up. I doubt he was expecting any communication, except maybe from his clerk, and I took advantage of those few seconds to observe him as a disinterested party might have. There was nothing in the quick movement of his hand or the rhythm of his shoulders to suggest that he was anything other than a professional middle-class gentleman. The light from the window behind him cast a white glow over his sandy-coloured hair, which was so far untouched by his advancing years. He raised his eyes to the door, and a brief look of astonishment passed across his features. I recognised the trace of otherworldliness he carried, which prevented me from believing in the picture a disinterested party might form of him. Young eyes in an older face, that quickly darkened and became unreadable. He stood up, the years seeming to fall away as he knocked aside his chair and walked round the desk towards me. I was conscious of the weight of the relief I felt upon realising my intrusion wasn't unwelcome. Still a flutter of insecurity remained. "Please don't be upset with me," I said, before he had a chance to speak. I grasped both his hands in mine, keeping him at some distance. "I should have written to you to let you know I was coming, but I decided it all of a sudden." "Nonsense," he replied. "Edith, my darling girl, I'm delighted to see you." He closed the gap between us and pulled me into his arms. It didn't matter how old I was. The safety and peace I felt with my face against his shoulder never changed. It was a victory over those who merely watched from the door. "Honestly," he said when we drew apart, "you can't imagine how wonderful it is to see you here at such a time. It's just the surprise I'd have wished for." "I would have come even sooner, but I was afraid of being a disturbance," I explained. "Then, when I didn't hear from you, I became impatient. Home has seemed emptier somehow this year." "I've been a rather poor guardian recently, I know," he said. "Please don't think I'm unaware of my neglect, or that you haven't been often in my thoughts. But with things as they are, I shouldn't burden you with this." He turned away, pulling another chair up to the desk, and tidying a space for me to sit. I felt a sting of disappointment that he should consider taking me into his confidence to be burdening me. "Prison things?" I asked tentatively as I sat down and removed my hat and gloves. He struck a match, taking great care over lighting the lamp which he carried back to the desk. The little extra light it afforded didn't add any warmth to the room, which contained more than the expected amount of dust. He took his time, sitting down opposite me. I knew he was debating whether to go on or to try and dismiss his last sentence. Prison things, he acknowledged, with a cynical twist to his mouth that disfigured all the brightness of a few moments ago. You know, sometimes I feel as though I'm inside it myself all the time, in fact. Opinions are harder by far to break than any bars, and the grasp it has over all of us who are connected with it. Sometimes I wonder if the real cost is yet to emerge. You'll wear them down, I said, holding his gaze. With work and in time. Yes, he said, work is not the part that troubles me. Time, on the other hand. Every day longer it takes me is a day that costs someone their chance of reparation. It's of little help to them to think that I'll get there in time. I must have looked resentful for a moment. Reaching across the desk, he took my hand in his, and I was surprised to find my fingers were shaking. But I know, he said, his voice softening, that your being here can only be of help to me. It's just that when the situation is as desperate as it has appeared these last months, well, I think we both know that I'm not likely to behave in a manner that's beneficial to anyone, myself least of all. He looked ashamed at having spoken harshly, but I knew it was the closest he would come to an apology. Apologies were something he could ill afford. Although his manner wounded me at times, I found myself admiring him all the more for it. It must have taken a certain kind of bravery, after all, to acknowledge the worst of his faults and be unrepentant. He squeezed my hand, and I knew the subject was closed. Tell me, he said, not unkindly, what's really brought you here all this way without a hint of warning? I was taken by such surprise at the directness of his question that I couldn't meet his eye. It wasn't fair that he in turn could shut me out so easily. My motive for coming now seemed the most childish of reasons. I hated that ability of his for switching back to the attack so quickly. I looked down at his pen, the mess of papers covering the desk. I've had some rather odd feelings. Odd feelings about what? I opened my mouth and closed it without saying anything. He was watching me, still patient. If there was a moment when I might have been able to leave matters as they were, resolved to put my darker thoughts aside, that must have been it. But I missed my chance, or rather he did. Can I talk to you about it later? I asked. Of course, he said, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Of course I could speak to him about an odd feeling, despite the strain showing in his face, a lasting effect of his ongoing struggles with the governors of Wandsworth, the prison whose gates were a mile from where we now sat, and which cast such a shadow over him. Of course he would have time to spare for me and my odd feelings. Those feelings had been encroaching on my peace of mind more and more that summer. Earlier in the year I'd gone to Paris with my favourite former teacher and a group of old school friends, but I'd tired of it and come home to our cottage in Hertfordshire. When I arrived, however, Sam was still in London. Our housekeeper, Mrs. Carter, had been astounded by my early return. It had taken all of my persuasive abilities to stop her from writing to him. I didn't want him to think of me as a wayward child trailing after him the moment I was left to my own devices. In the end, however, I'd been unable to stand his continued absence and had run after him anyway. I didn't mind, though, now that I was here. Who's the boy I met at the door? I asked, grasping the opportunity to change the subject. Oh, you mean Joseph? He's the new clerk. You don't mean Clifford's left? Certainly not. He seemed vaguely amused by my confusion. Can you afford to pay 2 clerks? He smiled. With the amount of work that place heaps on me, I can no longer afford not to. And besides, I can't pretend that Clifford will stay with me forever. It must be nearly half my life that he's been with you. I can't imagine this place without him. Nor I, but he's far too capable to still be a clerk. He's longing to strike out alone, we both know it, though I worry he's grown attached to his position here. Well, you only have yourself to blame for it. He gave me an appraising look. I only meant that I think it's you he's grown attached to, rather than the position, I said. And if he's happy, why not let him remain? It's rather unfair, isn't it, to replace him before he's ready to leave? You're probably right, but I don't want him to stay with me if it's not what's best for him. No doubt I'll regret it once he's gone. You've grown attached to him as well. I suppose he is the closest thing to a son of your own. Just for a moment he looked thought out, a slight stiffening of the shoulders, his eyes losing their opaque quality. I don't think any son of my own would have filled Clifford's shoes, he replied. Then, how did you find Paris? I was expecting you to return a great artist. I took my time answering. It was important that I find the right words. I'll never be an artist, and Paris proved it. And I'm not sure now that I really want it to be. I enjoyed seeing my friends again, but I wasn't sad to come home. But it would be a shame to give it up entirely, he said. You needn't go abroad, you know. There are a number of good schools here in London. I hope you won't abandon your education now, unless of course you plan to be a tortured genius and live off your uncle's charity. Although his smile was genuine, I was aware of a stab of guilt. He might make a joke of it, but he had spent a good deal of money on my education. I wondered now if he'd been expecting a better return on his investment. It's not that I don't enjoy learning, I said. It's just that I'm not sure I want to dedicate myself, and I don't intend embarking on anything without the desire to see it through. I'm glad to hear it. It was worth coming all the way from Hertfordshire for those words. As he straightened the papers on his desk, I cast my eye over the room. It had been well over a year since we'd been together in this office, and though I was used to its general air of disorder, every inch of space was taken up by papers and books. There was something about it today that unsettled me. It was colder than I remembered, despite the window behind the desk letting in some brightness. Summer was clearly receding early from our corner of the city. It made me long to be outside again, and was wondering how successful I might be in persuading him to leave the office for a walk, when I saw the mattress in the corner of the room, the blanket strewn over it, just visible under a heap of documents. Have you been sleeping here? I asked. I've been so absorbed by this business with Wandsworth. You know what it means to me, and others besides. I have to give it my full time and attention, he answered, picking up his pen and rolling it between his fingers. An ink stain travelled along his palm onto the greying cloth of his shirt cuff. And what will it mean to those who are relying on you if you don't take care of your own health? I replied, standing up. How can you be of use to anyone at all if you make yourself ill? Edith, I am quite well, he said firmly. You don't look it. He laughed, though his eyes didn't soften. Thank you, my dear. I'm only telling you the truth. You look thoroughly worn out. You have a house and a bed a mere street away. You're not tied to this place, are you? Sometimes it feels that I am. We were interrupted by a knock. Clifford came in with a bundle of letters under his arm. He looked older than I remembered. He had to be nearly 30 by now. His complexion was so fair he was almost sickly looking, as though he was already closer to the angels than the rest of us. Clifford, I said, turning on him, are you aware that your master has been sleeping on the premises? Edith, will you leave the poor man alone? Said Sam, getting to his feet to relieve him of the papers. When we were both standing, there was little difference in our heights, and Clifford appeared rather dwarfed between us. I'm sorry, I said, but my uncle seems to be under the impression that he's indestructible, and I can tell already that you agree with him. He does pay my wages, Miss Hawkridge. His eyes met mine, and I detected a knowing look that was gone before he turned back to Sam. Mrs. Carter wished me to inform you that she has gone to inspect the house. Ah, thank you, Clifford. If you spent more time in the house you pay to live in, I said, once Clifford had shut the door behind him, Mrs. Carter wouldn't have reason to be displeased with you when we visit. I'm sure Mrs. Carter is already displeased at being hauled away from the country. She despises London at the best of times. She only pretends to hate it here, so it gives her an excuse to scold us both. Anyway, this time she blames you, not me. He was laughing again. It really is good to see you. He walked around the desk. You must try not to worry about me so much, my love. I'm not infirm yet. Nor will you ever be, I replied, lowering my eyes. Perhaps I do worry unduly, that I haven't seen or heard from you in months. Did you even realise when I came in that I wasn't supposed to be back in England yet? Ah, I knew there was something amiss in that. His hands were on my arms as he stood back, as though granting me the opportunity of forgiving him. I don't want to be an inconvenience, I said, his continued gaze forcing me to look up. And I certainly don't want to be your nursemaid, but you're not indestructible and you have to realise it. It isn't just me who cares about you. I'm sorry if you think I'm speaking out of turn. If I hadn't wanted you to always speak plainly, I wouldn't have brought you up to. It was unfair of me, I know, not to write for so long. I have lost myself to some extent this year. I drew closer and kissed his cheek. It was warmer than I'd been expecting, and he looked a little taken aback, but grateful nonetheless. I read that a little bit rushed, so hopefully that wasn't too terrible. I think I only stumbled a few times. I'm a bit funny sometimes with reading my own stuff especially. But so yeah, it's 272 pages at the moment, and that was, I think, about the first 8 with it double-spaced. It's the beginning, obviously, of the first chapter. I quite like jumping in on things and just going. I don't really like lots of sort of exposition-y chapters. I think a little bit can be okay, but I struggled with that for a long time, so I wanted to kind of get it going. As you could probably tell, it's historical. It's actually set in 1904, and it's basically a historical mystery. I think it's quite straightforward in terms of the genre, but hopefully I've made something a little bit interesting with it. It's basically about the girl who, obviously, I was just speaking, because that's the point of view it's told from, and her relationship with her uncle has brought her up, and her basically finding out some stuff about his past. There's quite a lot of danger, I think. If I've done it right. It moves from London into the sort of country seaside of Falmouth, which is on the coast, and there's an element of romance in it, but hopefully it's not too much romance, because although I do like a love story, I don't like it when that kind of overcrowds something else. I think just writing romance can be a bit and hopefully it's sort of a good relationship that I've shown when that gets going, but that gets going somewhere later. And hopefully, I think that's the bit that I've done most differently. But I don't know. And really, I'd need someone who's really sort of clued up on the genre, because I thought I was, and then I started writing and started researching, and turns out I'm not anywhere near as clued up as I thought. So yeah, I've kind of been working on it for a long time. Reached a point where I think there's very little I can now do to edit it. I've done a lot of edits, given it out to lots of people, got lots of feedback, cut quite a lot that didn't work, made quite a lot of big changes, and I'm at the point now where I'm just reading through and changing like 4 words maybe in a chapter. So yeah, but I mean, I might be wrong. I need to really just decide whether I'm going to actually send it out into the world or not. Yeah, and I'm not really sort of bothered by the idea of rejection so much. I think that's just part of what we have to expect. Everything can't be successful on its first try, so you have to be prepared for that and to keep going, which I am. I think it's just more a bit of a perfectionist. I'm never quite 100% convinced that anything I do is really sort of ready. So this is kind of like the first step to actually sort of sharing it out there. And any feedback or comments, even if it is negative, that's fine. You can tell me it's boring. It's probably not going to be everybody's cup of tea. It's what I like to read. It's in that genre, because I think the first thing that you really write, probably nearly for everybody, is stuff that they are familiar with and they like, and it's in that kind of, you don't really step out of your comfort zone until I think you've tried a few things, although I'm sure there's people that are more talented that could manage that. So yeah, and it's aimed at adults. I think it would be accessible to teenagers as well, but it's not for that audience. It's not young adult. It's not teenage. I tend to kind of I'm not so keen on crossovers unless they're done very well. Some people can do that very well, and I don't think I can. I'm not really that interested in the young adult stuff. I don't read a lot of young adult, so I always knew I wanted to write something that was going to be aimed entirely at adults. But, it probably is accessible too. It's not, well, I hope it doesn't come across as stupidly lofty, and I hope it's something that other people could access. But yeah, that's what it is. So yeah, I'll say goodbye. Hopefully I didn't bore people too much, and I might read some more on here. I might not, depending on what I decide to do. So, bye bye.